Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah Kim. I'm the director of the Cheongintang East Asian Library at the University of Toronto. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. On behalf of the East Asian Library, I'd like to welcome you all to the East Asian Library's Resources Access Grant Program COVID-19 Scholar Talk entitled How to Produce Learning, Some Preliminary Thoughts on Neo-Confucian Knowledge Culture, 1200 to 1700. This event is sponsored by the Department of East Asian Studies of the University of Toronto. Our speaker today is Dr. Liam Bin Dai, who is a sinologist specializing in the cultural and social history of late imperial China. He teaches at the University of Victoria. And for our moderator today, we have Professor Nathan Vidal from the Department of the East Asian Studies at the University of Toronto. Dr. Dai was one of the East Asian Library's recipients of the library's Resources Access Grant Program COVID-19 for 2022 last year. His talk will focus on his current research, which has made use of the East Asian Library's resources. As access to library collections continued to be restricted last year due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the library offered special support for faculty and doctoral students in the field of East Asian Studies in Canada to conduct research at our library in 2022. The aim of the program was to provide equity and access to East Asian Studies resources during the pandemic. Before inviting Professor Vidal to introduce our speaker and moderate the session, I'd like to introduce Dr. Vidal. He is an assistant professor at the Department of East Asian Studies here at the University of Toronto, and is broadly interested in the intellectual, cultural, and literary history of late imperial China and early modern East Asia between roughly the 15th and 19th centuries. He employs approaches from book history and the history of science and humanities to his research on the circulation of knowledge and books. His first monograph, The Culture of Language in Ming China, was published by Columbia University Press last year and examines the history of language study and the formation of scholarly disciplines in China from the 16th through 18th centuries, demonstrating how the boundaries surrounding linguistic study shifted according to contemporary intellectual trends. His current research examines the concrete practices underlying how early modern scholars compiled reference works such as encyclopedias, and how readers and writers put them to use. Other research interests include Manchu intellectual and literary culture, historical practices of commentary and annotation, and early modern forms of visualizing knowledge. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming the moderator of our event, Professor Vidal.
Thank you, Hannah. It's really my pleasure to moderate today's talk and to continue to introduce Dr. Dai Liam Bin, who will be presenting his latest research. Dr. Dai received his PhD at University of Oxford, and before that his master's at UBC over on the West Coast. Since receiving his doctorate, he has both taught and researched at a number of institutions, including the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, at Harvard, where we met we were just talking back in 2013-14, as well as recently here in our neck of the woods at York University, and then, as Hannah mentioned, currently at University of Victoria. Dr. Dai's research is very wide-ranging, so it's a little difficult to encapsulate briefly, but I'll just say that he probably to summarize at the broadest level, he specializes in late imperial Chinese intellectual, social, and cultural history, with, I think, particular interest in book history and shifts in modes of knowledge production. He is, I understand, completing his book monograph, so we will keep our eyes out for that on the shelves with great expectation, but we'll also get a sneak peek at that book project through today's talk, which will touch on, I think, many of the major themes and ideas and theories that he is developing in that book. So I look forward to hearing this talk. We'll have, of course, afterwards a Q&A session. So please make note of your questions and then hold on to them until the end of the talk, at which point you can share them either through the chat or we'll be able to individually call on people as well at that point. So without further ado, Dr. Dai, if you will take us from here then and introduce what you'll be talking about. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for your introduction, Nathan, and thanks also to Hannah and her team for organizing this event, and to everyone here for your interest in this topic. My special thanks go to Professor Joan Judge of York University and the staff of YCAR. My talk actually is derived from my project sponsored by Joan in YCAR several years ago. Actually, I owe them a talk, and from me is the book. Sorry for being laggard. So today, I'm very happy to share with you some of my preliminary thoughts about New Confucian knowledge culture from 1200 through 1700. Knowledge here doesn't mean knowledge as truth, right? But it refers to ideas and understandings about nature and human society that people believe true, including ideology, theology, and even superstitions, and so on. By New Confucian knowledge culture, I mean the ways in which New Confucian activists produced, innovated, and applied knowledge. Zhu Xi, the New Confucian master, developed the norms of New Confucian knowledge practice, and since the 14th century, his program largely had dominated the innate New Confucian intellectual life. His system or his learning specifically has been known as learning of the way, in contrast to learning of mind that we will discuss later. Zhu Xi's dominance and orthodox in knowledge practice were challenged in the 16th and the 17th centuries mainly by learning of mind, and then restored and recognized again by the end of the 17th century, also by some learning of mind activists. So my exploration covers these 500 years. Because of time limit, I will select a few historical moments and figures to illustrate this fluctuation, rather than make a general and comprehensive description. My interest in New Confucian knowledge culture was inspired by a question about the nature of learning in Chinese 学. In the New Confucian tradition, all the discourses, programs, and systems are called learning, 学. So by learning, New Confucian scholars obviously meant modern philosophy or moral philosophy. In New Confucian canonical texts, such as the collection of Zhu Xi's conversations topically arranged, 诸子语类, edited in 1263. In this book, metaphysical discussions are only a very small portion. More pages are devoted to the themes of, Confucian classicals, history, the nature, other beliefs, and intellectual traditions, politics, the Sun politics, and literature, institutions, and so on. So these diverse things normally were arranged by a rational. We will discuss this rational later. So therefore, I assume that New Confucian learning was intended not to be a philosophy as we understand today, but a secular, innate, scholarly knowledge system and knowledge matrix. By knowledge system, I mean a conceptually constructed and dynamic body of ideas and understandings that generate and represent contents, components, and types of knowledge, reinforced by a set of logical relationships that connect them. By knowledge matrix, I mean the autonomy of knowledge from political and economic contexts. Knowledge intrinsically, determines its own construction, reproduction, communication, and knowledge also describes, defines, and builds social realities. So this theoretical presumption is different. From the conventional sociological concepts of knowledge. Conventionally, knowledge production tends to be reduced to a set of social practices similar to economics or politics, right? This is this kind of respectively, Marxian metaphor and the Nietzschean metaphor. Most sociological inquiries naturally converge politics and economics. However, they normally disregard the autonomy of knowledge, whose production is not merely fashioned by economic and political elements, but also routinized in its own way, independent of other social practices. So a way out of this dilemma is to conceive knowledge as a cultural construct. It's not only derived in and through a social order, but also devises and communicates a social order. It helps people build and maintain their identities and legitimate their actions and authority. It even serves as ideologies to distort, justify, or mystify group world views and interests. So unquestionably, New Confucian learning had served as a knowledge matrix in these ways. So given the thematic variety of the New Confucian knowledge system, my exploration is focused on the methodological principles that New Confucians had developed, and as well the patterns in which they applied the methodological principles to knowledge practice. So therefore, I will not discuss any philosophical concepts or statements New Confucians made, but on their knowledge practice, that is how they produce learning. Zhu Xi developed and justified New Confucian learning as a knowledge system and a knowledge matrix, which specifically has been known as learning of the way. This knowledge system, or learning, as Zhu Xi himself named, covers much more than the Confucian morality. Instead, it covers all roles Confucian scholars are assumed to take, and all knowledge and skills they are expected to possess as secular units. Just as he said in 1186, learning can't be defined as only one sort of thing. Nowadays, scholars tend to treat only moral rules and practice as learning. Definitely, this is wrong. This is Zhu Xi's word, right? His learning can't be reduced into philosophy, nor simply labeled moralist. Instead, it is very inclusive and comprehensive. In Zhu Xi's view, New Confucian learning entails not only apprehending, model principle or principle, P is the capital, but also applying principle to human activities, especially to social and political practice. So principle is the core category in New Confucian learning. It means the rules or the rule that regulates a thing to be what it is. This is the definition, New Confucian definition of principle. Hence, New Confucian learning consists of knowledge and action, or knowing and acting. So to apprehend principle and apply it to socio-political practice, according to Zhu Xi, one should study the Confucian classicals to understand the ancient sages' wisdom, study history to grasp the historical trend and precedence of applying the ancient wisdom, and finally, apply what he has learned from the classicals and history to human activities. So we can view Zhu Xi's norm of knowledge practice as an intellectualist way. So therefore, New Confucian learning means a knowledge system rooted in the Confucian classicals, corroborated by historical studies and oriented to statecraft. Moral self-cultivation is just the start point of learning, while socio-political engagement is the end point. Within this knowledge system, Zhu Xi designed a textual and knowledge hierarchy. As you can see in these two diagrams, the 4 books are the core texts, and from core to periphery are the 5 classicals, standard histories, other philosophical writings and literature. So learning of the way, his learning of the way, or New Confucian learning, enjoys its hegemony over other branches of knowledge. It is directly grounded or rooted in the classical exegesis, since the 4 books are the core and the 5 classicals also are fundamental. History and other branches of knowledge are used to support, here, classical exegesis, and eventually reinforce the hegemony of learning of the way, or learning of or New Confucian learning. Correspondingly, Zhu Xi's curriculum and pedagogy require students focus on the 4 books and then the 5 classicals, one of the 5 classicals, and their ultimate purpose to be to master the way as the ultimate truth. Many Song scholars now, as intellectual historians, have discussed Zhu Xi's curriculum and pedagogy. So the Confucian learning the Confucian classicals are the pillar of this knowledge system. In Zhu's program, phrenology is the departing point towards the wisdom embedded in the classicals. If an understanding of the wisdom is questionable, then go back to the classical text and phrenology. This phrenological approach demands very high linguistic and literary competencies to understand the ancient texts, and only the well-trained Confucian elite could develop these competencies and monopolize the interpretation of the Confucian tradition. I specify this kind of phrenological approach as the classicist textual approach to New Confucian learning. Zhu Xi also designated to the knowledge of the classicals the ultimate purpose of socio-political engagement by advocating personally experiencing and practicing what one had learned. Practicing or acting also legitimizes knowledge, as the Confucian classics do. This way, his New Confucian learning was directed to Confucian statecraft that covers all the aspects of human society and even the natural world, as we can see in statecraft writings from the Song, even from the Song to the Ming, to the later Ming. Zhu Xi defended his knowledge system and pattern against his contemporary rivals, especially Lu Jiuyuan and Lü Zhuqian. While Lu Jiuyuan, the pioneer of learning of mind, emphasized the role of mind in moral cultivation, Zhu Xi upheld the priority and superiority of book learning, particularly studying the classicals over mind in both moral and intellectual advancement. Lü Zhuqian and his followers pursued the ancient wisdom in historical studies, especially Chunqiu, right? The spring and autumn annals. Zhu Xi insisted on studying the Confucian classicals over history on the grounds that the wisdom in the classicals was ultimate and universal, whereas history simply focused on the gain and the lost. So highlighting the hegemony of the classicals, Zhu Xi justified the legitimacy of his knowledge system and its innate, right? Innate in the Confucian tradition. Zhu Xi's followers believed that he had discovered the ultimate truth. After his death, their first task was to put his learning into socio-political practice to perpetuate it. The civil examination system was an ideal venue. In the 13th century, attempts already were made to integrate his learning into the civil examinations. The Mongol Yuan court designated in 1314 his contemporary on the 4 books to be the subject of the civil examinations, and the Ming court ideologized his learning in 1415 in the Compendia trilogy. This trilogy, were the main standard textbook for Confucian schools and the civil examinations. So Zhu Xi's learning, or Zhu Xi's knowledge system, finally was infused into Confucian education and the civil examination system. This imperial institutionalization and ideologization of Zhu Xi's learning took 100 years. The institutionalization and the ideologization were the result of a long negotiation between the imperial power and the new Confucian society regarding the legitimacy of knowledge and its application. Both parties expected to standardize the interpretation of Zhu Xi's learning through standardizing the civil examinations and school curriculum. Emperor Yongle won this negotiation and formalized its triumph in the above-mentioned Compendia trilogy in 1415. Emperor Yongle acclaimed himself to be a sage emperor and an orthodox adherent to Zhu Xi's learning, as Professor Ben Ehrman argues. So Emperor Yongle selected the Xing'an school of Zhu Xi's learning to dominate the compilation of the Compendian trilogy. This Xing'an school had enjoyed a reputation for its fundamentalist and exegetical and elaboration of Zhu Xi's commentaries on the 4 books with very, very little socio-political injections. This is why Emperor Yongle favored the Xing'an school. The Compendian, trilogy regulated what legitimate knowledge was and closely tied the new Confucian unit with the imperial power through the civil examination system. The elitists of new Confucian learning was imperially and institutionally established. This ideological enterprise resulted in the separation of new Confucian learning from classical exegesis, not the classical texts themselves, nor Zhu Xi's original interpretation, but the Songyuan Saber commentaries, especially the Xing'an tradition, on Zhu Xi's commentaries on the 4 books, decided how Ming students understood the classicals and Zhu Xi's learning. The institutionalization of Zhu Xi's learning also reduced the comprehensive and inclusive knowledge system that Zhu had planned. First, the 1314 examination pattern, the Yuan Mongol one, reduced the approach to understanding the classicals into Zhu Xi's learning, and in particular his commentaries on the 4 books. Then the 1415 Compendia trilogy further reduced Zhu Xi's learning into the Xing'an exegetical elaboration of his commentaries. So reduction makes an ideology more acceptable approachable, manageable, and then more straightforward and effective in legitimizing a political power and social order. The expense is very high. The expense is that Zhu Xi's learning was re-proposed. Right? So the Ming Confucian students encountered not the authentic Zhu Xi, but one Zhu Xi represented in the Compendium trilogy in the name of promulgating his learning. So more noticeable is that action or acting, especially self-cultivation, as a part of New Confucian learning was neglected. Of course, personal values and conducts are hard to be assessed in the civil examinations, right? In the 15th century, Ming China experienced a series of military, political, and economic crises. These crises alerted the New Confucian society. Would the highly esteemed New Confucian learning still work in state government or family regulation? And more importantly, how should the unit practice it? Correspondingly, the New Confucian world saw the advocacies of cultivating mind, since they realized that neither moral performances nor administrative abilities of officials recruited from the civil examinations met the Confucian expectations. So these advocacies of cultivation mind, I believe, were not meant to challenge Zhu Xi's learning, but instead to recover it to be practiced properly. This is my opinion, different from the conventional one. So the 15th century New Confucian scholars have a different target. So their target was not Zhu Xi himself, but the Ming imperial version of Zhu Xi's learning. This intellectual trend was represented by the four so-called pure Confucians, Cao Duan, Xue Xuan, Wu Yubi, and Hu Juyan. I spent a lot of time on them. Their concentration on Confucian morality and adherence to authentic Zhu Xi's learning brought them the reputation of purity. In their theories, self-cultivation is a solution to the sensed socio-political issues. The four pure Confucians did so because they believed that Zhu Xi already had possessed the ultimate truth. Their first task should be to practice Zhu Xi's learning properly, rather than to repeat Zhu Xi's investigations, right? So in terms of practicing, one simply could start with cultivating mind. Mind cultivation was not the end of these four pure Confucians learning, nor their beginning. Instead, they intended to extend their cultivated mind to others through socio-political engagement. Why? The four pure Confucians remained to be a part of Zhu Xi's tradition rather than initiating a learning of mind, at least in terms of knowledge concepts and practice. First, they insisted on studying the original Song New Confucian canons, especially Zhu Xi's work, as the only orthodox way towards the Confucian wisdom in the classicals. Notwithstanding, their the underrated the philosophical or classicist textual approach to learning and ignored classical exegesis, which wouldn't be good. Book learning, though limited to the Song canons, was still the main way to learning. So mind cultivation wouldn't be possible without studying the Song canons. Third, practicing Zhu Xi's learning was prescribed for the absence of self-cultivation in the examination culture and the compendium trilogy. Fourth, self-cultivation was an integral and prerequisite part of their socio-political discourses. They didn't keep themselves aloof from the Confucian statecraft tradition and socio-political concepts. So according to their extent connections. From 1500 onwards, the Zhu Xi's program of learning encountered, a substantial challenge from learning of mind, which partly dominated the 16th and 17th century Chinese intellectual discourses. This new program, developed by Wang Souren, attracted diverse followers ranging from elite gentry officials to illiterate commoners. This intellectual change conventionally has been viewed as revolutionary, right? In terms of knowledge culture, Wang Souren was definitely subversive to Zhu Xi's norms. Wang Souren encountered a social change that the pure Confucians hadn't done. That is, rising merchants challenged the innate status of Confucian gentry. The blurring of social, cultural, and economic boundaries traditionally separating the literati gentry from merchants concerned the new Confucian society. Unprecedented temptations and desires for wealth and luxury goods penetrated all social groups, and this, in the Confucian tradition, contributed to a general moral degeneration. A plausible approach was to redesign the regulations of human relations or to justify such kind of social change. So Wang Souren was the spokesman in this social undertaking. He provided a moralist prescription for the social crisis based on his core concept of innate knowledge or innate moral knowledge. By innate knowledge, one meant the innate moral rules in people's mind. Wang Souren's learning initiated a moralist campaign at the expense of intellectualism and knowledge practice. This moralist campaign was intended to impress the Confucian social order upon its participants through collective experience rather than to encourage individual independence or self-resilience in social life. So I don't think Wang Yangming's learning, Wang Yangming advocated such kind of individualism or something like that. So Wang Souren and his followers realized the social makeup of their audience had altered, expanding beyond the Confucian elite to include those who were from the commercial stratum of society they needed to adjust their pedagogy and legitimate it anew. Hence, controversies over the goal of Confucian learning and approach to it arose in the Confucian world. In terms of the Confucian knowledge practice, the focus was whether book learning or mind was the source of learning, and what role book learning would play in relation to mind cultivation. In his moralist prescription, Wang Souren developed an extreme version of moralism. He reduced socio-political crisis into a moral crisis and viewed the moral principles or rules as the universal prescription for all issues and the highest stand ruling things, which is quite different from Zhu Xi's concept of learning, of principle. Wang Souren's ultimate principle, embodied in innate knowledge, obviously was nothing but moral. He created two idioms. Mind means principle, and no principle external to mind. So by these two items, we can say that Wang Souren exactly simplified principle, the concept of principle, which made a thing what it is, right? This is the meaning of principle. And Wang Souren simplified principle into the moral principles or rules intrinsic to mind. So mind in Wang Souren's system was the only source of the moral principles or rules. To apprehend principle that was moral, one should return to his mind rather than to things external to mind, such as the Confucian classicals. This is a very different approach from Zhu Xi's. Morality became the sole subject of learning and the only standard for assessing human activities, while other social activities and early natural phenomena beyond morality were deliberately excluded from learning. Since only innate knowledge knew whether a thought was good or evil, one should follow his innate knowledge. So when innate knowledge confirmed a good thought, one should love and practice it. Otherwise, he should hate and get rid of it. So this is why I mean a suggestion about practicing morality or practicing innate knowledge. So Wang theoretically converted his learning into an extreme version of moralism in his break with Zhu Xi's tradition. Wang Souren moralized his program at the expense of book learning. Even though he himself read widely, he downplayed knowledge and skills acquired through book learning, denouncing them for raising selfish desires to the detriment of principle. Perhaps this was the first time of book learning to be considered immoral in the new Confucian tradition. Since exercising innate knowledge was the only way to achieving sagehood, knowledge and skills other than the moral rules were of no help, right? Wang Souren decries philological studies of the classicals for being trivial and misfocused. In Wang Souren's theory, human mind is self-sufficient and naturally contains the sage's wisdom, and book learning only stirs up selfish desires, just as he says. As their knowledge becomes more extensive, their selfish desires become more numerous, and as their ability become greater and greater, heavenly principle becomes increasingly obscured from them, just as like Mao Zedong, right? So Wang downplayed the linguistic, literary, and intellectual prerequisites for moral self-cultivation, perhaps because he had been disappointed in the moral degeneration among contemporary Confucian literati and officials. Moreover, his approach of practicing innate knowledge seemed easier and thus more appealing than Zhu Xi's, right? Which is which demands rather high competencies. For the illiterate and for largely non-literate society from which most of his non-innate audience came. Since knowledge and skills produce selfish desires, why shouldn't one simply learn to be a sage, but ignore knowledge and abilities? This way, everyone, either literate or illiterate, was able to become a sage by practicing his innate knowledge only. This is a sort of moral egalitarianism, suspecting the Confucian innate and encouraging the non-innate in the moralist campaign. In his later years, Wang Souren totally denied the significance of book learning. Around 1525, he theorized this denial as pulling up the root and stopping up the source of evil. The fundamentals of learning, Wang told one of his disciples, consist only in recovering that which is common to our original mind, and are not concerned with any specific knowledge or skill. Thus, for Wang Souren, the less educated could be closer to sagehood than the well-educated. In Wang Souren's intellectual practice, however, book learning and the classicals remained to be the main value to knowledge acquisition and intellectual pursuit. But he was not as good at classical exegesis as Zhu Xi had been. He didn't ground his system upon classical exegesis, but attempted to break the constraints that the classicals tried to impose on him, just because because of his concept of innate knowledge. Indeed, the classicals were still the core texts on his required reading list. He just underrated the exegesis that Zhu Xi recommended and made, and hence limited his recommended readings to the classical texts only as an approach towards innate knowledge. So the term, in terms of hermeneutical practice, Zhu Xi grounded his learning of the way on his classical exegesis, but Wang Souren eroded this base in his textual practice because he was not good at this. But why Wang Souren still, insisted on recommending the classicals to his sons and students, because studying classicals is part of Confucian and the new Confucian identity, right? And identity. So studying the classicals had been a part of the Confucian and the new Confucian identity. It also lent legitimacy to students' knowledge practice and their socio-political engagement. Both Zhu Xi and Wang Souren recognized the way of Confucius and Mencius as the orthodox. The focus is not on what the way is, but instead on how to apprehend the way. So notwithstanding phenomenological understanding of the classicals had been indispensable, providing every Confucian scholar with the materials to serve the purpose of argumentation. So Wang Souren also gave his students phenomenological instructions, advising them that every word and every phrase should be investigated and gone over again and again, as Zhu Xi had done. So in the Confucian tradition, therefore, philosophical skepticism and subversion may put everything into question but phrenology. Phrenology has conventionally been an instrument, not an object of any skeptical examination. Unsurprisingly, Wang Souren had to accept and use phrenological studies of the classicals in his intellectual practice, even though he devalued phrenology to highlight moral cultivation. So Nathan does a great job in his book, and highly recommended. From Wang's mixture attitude towards book learning, we can perceive tensions between his hypothesis and practice. For example, he emphasized the role of mind over that of book learning, but he achieved his intellectual accomplishments mainly based on what he read. While upholding the sovereignty of the classicals in the continuity of Confucian tradition, his interpretation of the Great Learning, Da Xue, was highly controversial because he ignored the internal logic and textual meaning. He decried wide reading and broad learning, but he himself was an erudite master of statecraft, literature, political and military subjects, in addition to, of course, philosophical subjects. So these contradictions in his system, I believe, resulted from his highly moralized program, which he intended as a puny moralist prescription for the socio-political crisis that he simplified into a moral crisis, as discussed above. So after Wang Souren's death, we still have time, dissension occurred within his immediate circle of disciples. They focused their controversies on how to practice innate knowledge to achieve sagehood. Meanwhile, like Wang Souren, they couldn't avoid assessing the role of book learning in self-cultivation. Wang Souren's disciples made different assessments of book learning in emphasizing innate knowledge over book learning. Radical devotees tended to deny book learning in practicing innate knowledge, while those orthodox still recognize the role of book learning, though secondary. Right? In the late 17th century, intellectualist critics came to notice the failure of the moralist campaign and attributed it to the denial of book learning. Also, the demise of the Ming Dynasty, particularly alerted learning of mind revisionists to the limits of practicing innate knowledge. They attempted to restore the role of book learning by borrowing Zhu Xi's concepts and pulling knowledge practice back to the track of intellectual needs. Among learning of mind revisionists were Liu Zhongzhou and Huang Zhongxi. Liu Zhongzhou revised Wang's theory and corrected a tendency of moral and intellectual skepticism prevalent among Wang's radical foreigners. As for Huang Zongxi, after the demise of the Ming Dynasty, he rediscovered the intellectualist goal of Confucian learning and ended the Ming controversies about how to approach that goal. Well, Huang Zongxi advocated that specialized skills were as valuable as aesthetic refinement and moral achievement. So this is quite different from Max Weber told us. Just like Zhu Xi, Liu Zhongzhou theorized book learning as a vital way to learning, not sufficient, but indispensable. And Liu Zhongzhou also suggested applying book learning to practicing innate knowledge. Liu Zhongzhou defined book learning, especially studying the classicals, as Confucian scholars' profession to cultivate morals and improve statecraft knowledge and skills, just as Zhu Xi had done. He believed that Zhu Xi deserved the same stature as Confucius had done in the Confucian tradition. Unlike Wang Souren, who downplayed book learning, Liu Zhongzhou believed that it could shore up people's mind against evil, and that Confucian students shouldn't put it away unheeded. Liu Zhongzhou suspected the applicability and practicability of learning of mind. Lu Jiuyuan's learning and Wang Souren's learning in socio-political fields. According to Liu Zhongzhou, Lu Jiuyuan's theory could be self-consistent in terms of arguing, but uncertain when applied to socio-political engagement. As for Wang Souren, who emphasized innate knowledge at the expense of book learning, Liu Zhongzhou thought that Wang Souren's approach could work for wise individuals, just like Wang Souren himself, but would fail for most people. It was not as universal as book learning for achieving sagehood. So Wang Souren's radical foreigners brought nothing, right, but chaos into the new Confucian world. This is Liu Zhongzhou's opinion. Book learning, however, doesn't automatically lead to moral advancement. Thus, after Zhu Xi and Wang Souren, Liu Zhongzhou advocated personally practicing the moral rules canonized in the classicals. He emphasized acquiring concrete knowledge and practical skills for statecraft, though insisted that sagehood was the ultimate purpose and the only stand of book learning. But his student Huang Zhongzhou was a little bit different from Huang Zongxi, from different Liu Zhongzhou, even though he carried on something from his master. After Liu Zhongzhou, Huang Zongxi confirmed a return to book learning. Huang Zongxi's distinctive contribution to the 17th century knowledge culture were his intellectual pluralities and new destination of learning. He valued both heroic quality and rational specialization. According to him, a man of charisma was a heroic, specialized expert. So, responding to the socio-political crisis and chaos he had witnessed and experienced during the Ming-Qing dynastic transition, Huang Zongxi redefined the purpose of learning to be developing a heroic personality of expertise rather than achieving sagehood only. So specialized fields of knowledge and skills, if constructive to social order, were as legitimate as orthodox classical exegesis and historical studies. For Huang Zongxi, heroes were highly skilled and intellectually independent. They might channel their ambition and spirit into various activities, ranging from, for example, philosophical writing to poetry, from music to drama. They could be Confucians, but equally likely could be Taoists, legalists, historians, classicists, essayists, poets, playwrights, and naturalists. Although the classicals remained fundamental for learning, other branches of knowledge were of equal intellectual autonomy and significance. So his view was clearly a challenge to the traditional knowledge hierarchy that we described earlier. Corresponding to his new purpose of learning, Huang Zongxi introduced intellectual diversity into the 17th century Confucian world. According to him, besides Zhu Xi's tradition, other Confucian explorations of the way, including Wang Souren's school, were also valuable, as we can see in his Minru Xuan, right, in which both orthodoxy and heterodoxy are included. So Huang Zongxi justified his challenge with the concept of that he borrowed from Zhu Xi. In his definition of learning, Huang proposed practicality, self-acquisition, and thus originality as the criteria and time limit. So he admitted that he borrowed those ideas from Zhu Xi, right? From Zhu Xi. Huang Zongxi's goal of learning, which was not to be a sage, but a specialized hero of charisma, reversed the tendency of moralizing knowledge practice. A heroic personality concerned with a socio-political engagement more than with abstract metaphysical discussions might be inferior to sages and worthies when it came to moral self-cultivation, but his professional skills were more significant and functional than moral didacticism. Huang Zongxi theoretically restored the intellectualist goal of learning that learning of mind Confucians had neglected since the early 16th century. So in this way, Huang Zongxi terminated the Ming Confucians concerning the purpose of learning and the approach to it, and he confirmed the failure of the moralist campaign that Wang Souren had prescribed for the socio-political crisis that had consumed Ming China since the mid-15th century. So for knowledge practice, especially concrete knowledge and practical skills acquisition, Zhu Xi's program, as Huang Zongxi confirmed, eventually was rediscovered as an effective paradigm. So, conclusion, very simple. As Zhu Xi developed New Confucian learning is an elite scholarly knowledge system and matrix. It's rooted in the study of the classicals, corroborated by historical studies, and oriented to statecraft. Despite of emerging philosophical skepticism, phrenology has remained the indispensable instrument, not an object of skeptical explorations. Zhu Xi's methodological principles and pattern for knowledge practice were institutionalized, questioned, challenged, and finally recognized by challengers. Until Liu Zongxi and Liu Zongzhou and Huang Zhongxi returned to Zhu Xi's pattern for producing learning, classical exegesis as the foundation of New Confucian learning had been neglected for over 200 years. In the second half of the 17th century, all those leading New Confucian scholars involved in the controversies between Zhu Xi's tradition and Wang Souren's tradition came to a consensus of returning to the classicals for the sage's meaning, for the sage's wisdom. Philology was recalled as the gateway towards understanding the classicals. This consensus anticipated the 18th century evidential scholarship. In terms of 16th to 17th century intellectual history, the 18th century evidential scholarship indeed witnessed a shift from philosophy to philology, or from metaphysical pursuits to evidential scholarship, just as Professor Benjamin Eilman has argued. In terms of the norms of knowledge practice, philosophically ambitious evidential scholars such as Dai Zheng here on this slide took the methodological principle, which is from philology to philosophy, right? From philology to philosophy, a principle that Zhu Xi invented, emphasizing the philological preparation for philosophical pursuits. Out of his philological studies of the classicals, Dai Zheng developed a different philosophical theory from Zhu Xi's, but his practice confirmed the hegemony of classical exegesis and Zhu Xi's methodological principle in the elite scholarly knowledge system in later imperial China. Again, New Confucian learning is an elite scholarly knowledge system and matrix. It is rooted in the classicals, corroborated by historical studies, and oriented to statecraft. Is this hypothesis helpful for us? I hope this hypothesis also will be helpful for us in understanding the modernization of knowledge system in modern China from the 1840s through 1949. The modern European knowledge system, which has already defeated and replaced the New Confucian one in modern China, features a root that the Confucian classicals couldn't have, features a historical experience that traditional Chinese historians had never known, and features an orientation to specialized knowledge and skills modern to statecraft. By 1949, Confucian elites in this traditional knowledge system had been destroyed in intellectual, social, and political revolutions. The New Confucian knowledge system has irretrievably collapsed and disappeared, even though occasionally it was imitated in Republican China and contemporary China, of course, with the new ideologies and the new knowledge hierarchies. So that means Zhu Xi's pattern is still there. The New Confucian, the pattern of New Confucian knowledge practice is still here, right? Okay, thank you so much. This is my talk. Thank you so much. Okay.
Right, let's all thank Lian Bin for this rich talk. And because I think we have now maybe just under 20 minutes for discussion, so we should really jump right in. As everyone thinks or gets their thoughts together, I'll begin with one question, but just as a reminder to the audience, you can type your questions into the chat and I'll read them out. You can also raise your hand with the icon for hand raising, and then we can call on you, mute you, and you can also turn on your video if you haven't already and you desire to. So again, think of what you would like to ask Lian Bin. I'll get us started with one question. So it seems to me that in this project, you're clearly revising our understanding of Neo-Confucianism's role in intellectual and social history. And I can imagine a number of ways in which you are posing an intervention. I think it would be useful for, especially if not everyone is as deeply immersed in the long history of scholarship on Neo-Confucianism, if you could sort of highlight where you are specifically changing some of the long-standing ideas about Neo-Confucianism. My more specific question along these lines, and not to put words in your mouth, but I think one of the areas in which you are doing so is highlighting the role of philology in this Neo-Confucian tradition. Typically, we do not associate the name Zhu Xi with philology, and you are in this project emphasizing how significant it was for grander moral and social political concerns of his. So from that perspective, and given especially the kind of longue durée of your research, I wanted to ask you about how that positioning of philology you think might change our understanding of this long trajectory of learning from the sort of the 12th, 13th centuries, and then pushing you perhaps even a little farther into the 18th and 19th centuries. There is always this idea that you highlighted of the shift philosophy to philology, which is, as you mentioned, Benjamin Ellman's very well-known, very persuasive thesis, but it's one that's rooted not so much in modern historiography as something that traces back to the 18th and 19th centuries. Certainly by the 19th century, there's this idea of Han learning, more philological. That's what we want to recover, versus Song learning, Songxue, which is characterized by abandoning philological concerns. So my question would be, do you see these 19th century scholars and then their influence later into the present as kind of overlooking or misrepresenting what Songxue or what Zhu Xi was really about? Or how does incorporating this philological value of this earlier period of Neo-Confucian learning under Zhu Xi change our understanding of the longer trajectory and shifts in intellectual culture?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So actually, I mentioned this tradition in my book manuscript. Of course, we can track the philological tradition back to, for example, to the Han Dynasty, and Zhu Xi definitely incorporated this Han tradition, this Han philological tradition to his knowledge practice. And Zhu Xi's contribution is to, for the first time, systematized philological tradition into a knowledge system, into his knowledge system, and designated to this philological tradition and philosophical task, right? A philosophical purpose. So according to Zhu Xi, you can't just linger over philological studies. You need to transcend to something, right? You need to get something. You need to make some metaphysical pursuit to abstract the sage's wisdom. So this is why Zhu Xi's learning of the way, or Neo-Confucianism, is different from the preaching and the Han Confucianism. Yeah, so Chinese phrenology enjoys has enjoyed a long tradition, but it was Zhu Xi for the first time to integrate this tradition into how can I say, into a, maybe we can say it's a philosophical enterprise or something like that. Thank you. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Thank you. Yes, so I'd like to open it up either through the chat or, oh, I see, it's Alison, if you can go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Lian Bin. Thank you, Hannah and Nathan, for organizing this. Lian Bin, I'm speaking as a non-specialist here at all, but with Huang Zongxi, this advocacy of other branches of knowledge, perhaps even professionalization, I was thinking presumably he is a product, very much a product of his times, because I think of the legal specialists that I've read and even the literary commentators, the idea of encyclopedias, how-to manuals, medical specialists, all these people were developing particular kinds of professional identities and putting forward the idea of practical knowledge around, well, in the 17th century. So what kind of practical knowledge was Huang Zongxi advocating? And is he a product very much of what was going on around him, or is he saying something different?
Yeah, I think, you know, Huang Zongxi could be the most erudite scholar in his 6th century. And so according to my reading of his books, you know, a huge connection, I just selected a few to read. I think first, he developed his own knowledge landscape to include both, you know, metaphysical pursuit or philosophical pursuit and the applications of his such kind of philosophy or such kind of metaphysical pursuit into society, into social and political practices. So we can say that he was interested in designing a new civil examination system. He was interested in military affairs. He's interested. He's a practitioner of kung fu, of martial arts. He's good at medicine, and he knows his knowledge of economic history, of even financial, was very rich, and he knows everything. He's definitely an encyclopedia. But so according to my understanding, he just, you know, he just didn't believe in any kind of extreme moralism. So just as I mentioned, he just, you know, he suggested that, you know, other expertises than classical exegesis or sagehood were as valuable as, you know, what Zhu Xi and and Wang Yangming advocated, and so he advocated a kind of individual intellectual diversities, and so this is I discussed this because, you know, Max Weber gave me some inspiration. Max Weber in his book Confucianism and Buddhism, right? So he just argued that Confucian or New Confucian units, the Confucian or New Confucian unit, just advocated some kind of aesthetic refinement or moral cultivation. And I just go, okay, Huang Zongxi didn't do so. Huang Zongxi and other, New Confucian scholars, they were good at many things. So I tracked. So I just think that Huang Zongxi restored the intellectualist goal of New Confucian learning, and such kind of intellectualist, I would like to track back to Zhu Xi rather than Wang Yangming. Wang Yangming and Zhu Xi are quite different. So, but Huang Zongxi, even his master Liu Zhongzhou, they keep their stance in learning of the way, but this is a kind of a Chinese tradition, right? So yeah.
Thank you. I was fascinated by this idea of this heroic, specialized, charismatic expert, because I do see that kind of rhetoric in say one particular legal expert I've looked at, and Judith Zeitlin has talked about it in terms of the doctors who sort of bustle in and know far more than anybody else. So it seems to be something in the air at that time, but it's a great concept.
I don't think it comes very that late. In my book chapter to Tim, I just noticed that Confucianism or the Confucian tradition had never neglected or ignored legalism or legalist techniques and tips. We can track this to Confucius, right? And Zhu Xi carried on this integration of Confucianism and legalism in his commentary to the Analects. And I also found that children, the most erudite statecraft scholar in the 15th century, he knew this tradition. I mean, this convergent tradition of Buddhism, of Confucianism and legalism very well. So legalist techniques and tips had never been separate from the Confucian tradition. Thank you.
Sure, we all aspire to this goal of being heroic, charismatic experts. Any other questions? While people think, we probably have another room for another couple of questions. One other I'll throw out there just along this line, because you just mentioned Huang Zongxi is potentially the most erudite person of this era, and I would think if there's any competition for that title, one might raise someone I know you've worked quite a lot on, so I'm mostly just curious for your perspective on a name that didn't occur in your talk, but appear in your talk, but Fang Yizhi, and where you might position him in relationship to people like Liu Zhongzhou and Huang Zongxi.
Yeah. Yes, actually, Huang Zongxi would be the protagonist of my next book. It's my dream, because Fang Yizhi intellectually significant because he tried to integrate the newly introduced modern European knowledge system or knowledge into his New Confucian knowledge system. So Fang Yizhi definitely was a part of this New Confucian tradition. And my interest is that why so how Fang Yizhi's pattern of dealing with European knowledge influenced the 18th century evidential scholarship. So I recently noticed that a Chinese scholar who wrote a book about the uses of astronomy in the evidential scholarship. I really like this book. He argues that evidential scholars who are good at astronomy, their studies of their astronomical they studied astronomy, European astronomy, just to glorify the Confucian tradition, glorify the wisdom embedded in the classicals. So this is because I would like to say this is because the new Confucian methodological principles and patterns of knowledge practice, controlled. They all were defined. They all defined their uses. They are uses of European astronomy. And back to Fang Yizhi, and I still remember Professor Yu Yinshi mentioned that both Fang Yizhi and Gu Yanwu, advocated the very close intimacy or close relationships between New Confucian learning, Li Xue, or and classical exegesis, Jing Xue, and in Chinese, Yu Li Xue Yi Jing Xue, or Yu Jing Xue Yu Li Xue. They just infused classical exegesis and New Confucian learning into each other. So this is Fang Yizhi and Gu Yanwu advocated so because classical exegesis had been ignored for almost 200 years. So they needed to return to classical exegesis to rediscover learning of the way, or learning, or New Confucian learning. Fang Yizhi is a part of this. Is part of this tradition, and this is Fang Yizhi's tradition. Another tradition, another contribution that Fang Yizhi made to this 17th century is that what I want to say is that he noticed that the newly introduced European science or scientific methods are very were very useful or very inspiring for Gewu, for investigating things, because neither Zhu Xi advocated Gewu, right, investigation of things to extend knowledge, but Zhu Xi didn't tell or didn't clarify how to investigate things. That is why Wang Yangming was kind of frustrated, right? At 17 years old. So Fang Yizhi just found that the European scientific methods could be used, could be borrowed to clarify how to investigate things in the New Confucian knowledge practice. This is a very interesting thing. I would like to, for example, this 物理想事，对不对？ This is Fang Yizhi's contribution to knowledge, to Confucian new Confucian knowledge practice.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I think we could potentially squeeze one more question on borrowed time here if there are any remaining. And if not, we will once again thank Dr. Dai Lian Bin for this fascinating talk and for sharing his research with us. We will look forward to the book. And again, thank you very much.